Welcome, everyone, to the 100 Monkeys of Hope podcast that Chrisna and I are putting together as our little way of reflecting on the book Designing for Hope that we wrote 10 years ago, as a way of trying to enable the book to be out there in the world. We're giving it for free online. And we thought it'd be nice to have a little podcast where we have a conversation around each chapter and our thinking and our experiences around that chapter, and also how things have progressed since then. This episode, we're talking about all things permaculture, looking at what it means to the journey of regenerative development, this whole concept of permanent agriculture, and some projects that we visited while we were working on the book. And then we'll touch on regenerative agriculture and the shift in mindset from farming to tending the land, and how that has so much potential in our future regenerative narrative. Strap yourselves in and let's go on the ride. Um, Acknowledgement for permaculture. Well, I have a great one. So it is our custom here in Australia and in New Zealand, I believe, and beginning in other places to do an acknowledgement of country, of place, of where we live at the start of important meetings, conversations. It is a way of honouring the land and the wisdom in the land and the people of that land. And Australians have been farming and in relationship with land for at least 65,000 years. And they're still with us. They're still here. It's a continuous link of that connection to country and that ability to build relationship with country and to farm and work with country in such a way as to nourish people. And so I think with that, I pay my deepest respects to elders past and present, and particularly those present sharing their stories and their wisdom with us today. Hi, Chrisna, how are you?
Very well, Dominic. Good seeing you again.
Nice to see you again. So last episode we talked about biomimicry and living machines and our strategies for working with nature. But we thought we'd put a little one aside in the area of permaculture because it is such a hands-on concept of the relationship between people and land. It is permanent agriculture, permaculture. And I would say that that is what our Indigenous peoples were doing, irrespective of if they moved around or if they stayed in one place. They were practicing a relationship with land that allowed them to have the food that they needed to thrive. And so for me, it deserved its own episode. What's your thoughts around permaculture?
No, I think you're right. It should have its own episode because it's a tradition that goes back tens of thousands of years, basically for as long as humans have been. I spoke about Aboriginal traditions in Australia, but I'm reminded of the book by Kat Anderson, Tending the Wild. And to understand how indigenous cultures for many thousands of years have had this relationship where they created an agricultural model that created food forests and landscapes where everything is still a functioning ecosystem, but it served both their food needs and also the food needs of other critters, if we can call it like that. And I think that a lot of the permaculture thinking comes from those very early traditions of understanding a place, seeing the patterns that sits in that place, seeing how it operates, it observing it, and then seeing how do we engage with the system in a way that would allow it to evolve so that it serves us, but that it also serves its own particular health. And I think it's that understanding the patterns that is the first and really important aspect for me around permaculture. That and the notion of that you go slowly. You don't, this is not a process that happens fast because things are growing. You are growing an ecosystem. You're not planting a row of cabbages that you're going to harvest at the end of the season and that's it. It's about really going in, seeing what works, how does the system self-regulate itself, where do I need to adjust my strategies and so that it can keep on evolving and growing and become fertile and thriving.
Mm. Yeah, that the permanent in the permaculture.
That's it.
It's yeah, I hadn't quite put it in that way, and that's yeah, great contribution. In the book, we put in the little swirl that talks about all of the principles of permaculture. We won't go through those today, but very worthwhile having a look at those. As I was reviewing the chapter for today, it struck me that Nate education and culture is one of the petals. And we
Mhm.
see those petals coming back in the Living Building Challenge, and we see the petals and the swirls coming back in so many aspects since permaculture in people's approaches to regenerative development and other net positive approaches. But that culture and education is so central to it for me was and ethics.
Mm.
Um, Resonates a lot with how I think about regenerative development. And so it was really foundational, I think, in our growth back towards the knowledge of the people that tended the land. It reminds me, Chrisna, you and I went when we spent some time together with our students in South Africa. We went to this amazing eco village.
Oh,
Um,
Solejo and near
yes,
Rustenburg, yes, in the northwest. And I
yes,
think what is wonderful about that example is that yes, they introduce permaculture, but the principles of permaculture are also used to create community. It's not just about growing food. It is about how do we apply these principles to how we create our own community, how we strengthen our community. And because they've got such a big educational focus over the years, I think it must have been thousands of people that have gone through Tlolego that has experienced both the educational offerings, but also under that nurturing and tending of who they can be as people in relationship to the world and how to see themselves as beneficial agents in the world. I
so
don't know what
so
your was there.
Oh, it was a very emotional experience for me being there. I hadn't realized that that was where I'd been conceived, probably too much information. But I just had this amazing emotional experience, particularly when we arrived and we spent an hour or so quietly walking around. And I walked around the spiral, and there was a storm coming over the horizon, and just the whole experience of it was for me phenomenal. And just being there and how it was set up um, was for me amazing. So yeah, I don't know, I don't remember its educational principles and so forth, but I think it was embedded in the way that we were welcomed to it and the way we built relationship with the place and how we all had jobs there and so forth. And for the week we were there, we all participated. Yeah. We weren't just passive
Yeah.
tourists. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. One of the things that so David Holmgren and Bill Mollison were kind of the people that originally kind of came up with this idea of permaculture. Of those two, David Holmgren is somebody that lives relatively closely, a couple of hours away, and so I've spent a bit of time with David on his property, taking my students there. But what I love is that he's brought his concepts of permaculture to what do we do with our suburbs? How do we bring those concepts of so yeah, retro suburbia is something that has evolved since we wrote the book. It's been before we wrote the book, it was definitely be in the book. That idea of how do we take the systems that we've kind of built not with that holistic thinking in mind and actually retrofit them in a way so that we can restart building our relationships with each other, our neighbours, and our land. And that just then takes me to regenerative agriculture and that concept of tending the earth and shifting from farming to tending the earth. But one of the things that I find really interesting often with when I look at regenerative agriculture is that people are talking about yields and increased water retention and increased nutrient quality and increased animal well-being and all of those sorts of elements. And they're talking about all of the physical outcomes, all of the physical flows that are being improved by this regenerative agriculture. And for me, the power is actually in the education, and that the farmers feel better and that they can go slower, and that for me there is that real missing element that farming doesn't have inherent in its name, whereas tending for your family, tending for the earth, it has a sort of more relational reflecting on it. And so for me, that's something that I just wanted to bring in here, that as we shift, as we start using these new concepts of regeneration, permaculture, and so forth, to always remember that we're people and we have our cultural, social way of making sense of the world. And it needs to be the invitation of that to come into the permaculture, to come into the biomimicry, to come into the biophilia, to come into the regenerative agriculture. That's the magic, and that's how it will be something where it, as we said last time, turns us towards the opportunities of a regenerative future, or away from that towards the mechanization of life and the losing of the potential of that life.
I think it's definitely a huge cultural shift that is happening. Because for so long, our agriculture has moved in, it's followed the logic of the factories. So it's become more and more mechanized, more and more focused on productivity and how do we use technology to make things much more productive that ends up in these large dairy farms and pig farms and chicken farms that are horrific conditions for animals to be in. And that then very rightly caused a backlash from people saying we should stop eating animals. And that is also, again, throwing things maybe to the other side. And something that stuck me in my head for a very long time is a few years ago, I visited a farm in Sweden where they were farming with traditional sheep and goats. And so we started talking to the farmer, and he said that he used to be a vegan until he looked at the land and how the land needs these ruminants. They need the little hooves to dig up the soil. They need the herds moving through, dropping, fertilizing. And if you don't have that movement, if you don't do that, then if you just leave them, then what do you do if your populations grow too big? So there needs to be a self-regulation mechanism in the system. And that self-regulation mechanism is things eating other things. And that how we, in our striving to do something that is good because we see something that is really horrific, we are creating another way of another dysfunctional system. So it's how do we see ourselves in this whole system of nature and enabling it through our own choices. And yes, I do think that there's huge problems with animal agriculture, but what is fantastic for me about regenerative agriculture is that it's starting to fix that because it needs the cattle to be able to graze and to move from one part of the land to another part so that you can fertilize the soil, so that you can grow things into it. And if you start seeing that as the cycle of life and us as part of the cycle of life, then it's a different perspective than just looking at this as a very black and white ethical issue. It becomes a much more nuanced ethics that's introduced.
And as we're closing out this episode here, one of the things that makes me think about is I've mentioned them before, Ian and Di Haggerty in WA in the wheat belt and the work that they've been doing with their land, but they call it natural intelligence farming. So it's like based on nature's intelligence. And so they actually use their sheep and looking after the internal gut of their sheep and making sure that they're eating good, nutritious feed and have the right microbiome, that they're creating the right microbiome in the soil. And from that, they're producing really great wheat and really great wool. And now they're collaborating with a bakery that just uses their wheat, and the bakery is thriving, and their wool is highly sought after. And by improving the soil and the plants and also looking after the remnant sort of vegetation in this very dry area where rain has been decreasing and decreasing over time, they're seeing an increase they're seeing that they're getting compared to other areas. They've created their own weather
Yeah.
microclimate because they're looking after the soil and the animals, and they're thinking about the whole
Mm.
system. And just an amazing program. And to see them talk about it in their humble way, it's just amazing. So that's our permaculture dive. I'm so glad that we made it its own episode. Next episode, we're going to reflect on what happens when we bring these ideas into the city. So the ideas of positive development and how does that feature in our discussion or our conversation about the history of regenerative development. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. Yes. Look forward to our next episode.